The order of the speeches today. First, I want to thank Tulsi Gabbard. She's a congresswoman from Hawaii, a very dynamic individual, one that I have great respect for. She has worn the uniform for this country, and she still is in the National Guard in Hawaii. She will be the first speaker. Then after her will be Bruce Fein. Bruce Fein is a constitutional lawyer in Washington, D.C. He brought this idea to Tulsi and myself months ago. We thought it was worthy of introduction, but we wanted to pick the right time. So Bruce will be speaking after Tulsi Gabbard speaks. Then Matthew Ho. I met Matthew years ago when I came out against the Iraq War. Matthew is a retired Marine captain who's had many jobs in and out of government. He will discuss that. Then Michael Marceau, president of D.C. chapter of Veterans for Peace. Then we have Paul Martin, senior director of policy and political affairs for Peace Action. After each one speaks, then I'll make probably 2 or 3 minutes of comments. Then we will open it up for questions from you. This is a very important news conference because it's time for Congress to take back the responsibility of sending our young men and women to die for this country. So with that, Congresswoman Gabbard will now speak.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to be here to join our discussion on this critical issue. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the exclusive authority to declare war. But the last time Congress officially declared war was December 8th, 1941, the day that the United States entered World War II. Ever since, Congress has failed to uphold this constitutional responsibility and has ceded this power to the presidents of both parties. So our country continues to remain in a state of perpetual war at a great cost to the American people and to the innocent civilians around the world who are affected by these wars, with no declaration of war by Congress and no say by the American people. The direct and indirect costs of these presidential wars are astounding. They take a toll on our troops, on our veterans, and on every single American. Since 9/11 alone, we've spent trillions of dollars on regime change, wars, and nation building, while communities here at home struggle and suffer due to a lack of resources being invested in fixing our crumbling infrastructure, in improving education, and making sure that everyone has access to health care, and so much more. What to mention the cost borne by our men and women in uniform, my brothers and sisters, our fellow veterans, both from those who have paid the ultimate price, who never made that long trip home, as well as those who did, but who come home with visible and invisible wounds. The American people deserve accountability from every leader who takes them and their families and our nation into war, and a Congress that upholds its solemn promise to protect and defend our Constitution. As representatives of the American people, we're introducing this resolution to make sure that Congress fulfills its constitutional duties and has robust, transparent debate before sending our troops off to fight in conflicts overseas, and to make sure that we have exhausted every diplomatic measure, only going to war as a last resort.
Hello, I'm Bruce Fein, and I think we authored the majority of HRes 922. It is a critical provision that attempts to provide real teeth in the Declare War Clause of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. Now, it's oftentimes said that there's some ambiguity in the clause. Maybe the president was endowed with power to go to war. That is truly fake news. Every member of the Constitutional Convention, every participant in the debate, every participant in ratifying the Constitution understood the Declare War Clause to mean only Congress could vote to take us from a state of war a state of peace to a state of war. And that included Alexander Hamilton, who said during the Barbary Wars that the plain meaning of the Declare War Clause is only Congress can take us from a state of peace to a state of war. Moreover, that particular requirement was not just some kind of scholastic tidiness about separation of powers. The drafters of the Constitution understood that as an institution, the executive branch would invariably concoct excuses for war for a simple reason. War aggrandizes executive power. It gets the money, it gets the patriotism, it gets the secrecy, it gets the honors. And that's why executives historically, as back as the Peloponnesian Wars, invent and concoct excuses for war. So the framers said only Congress that has no conflict of interest can decide whether or not to move from peace to war. And remember, the definition of war is rather grisly. It is the legalization of first-degree murder. It means you can kill people not in self-defense, and that ordinarily is punished as first-degree murder. That's why it's serious business, and why the framers thought it was so important to entrust the decision to those who had no conflict of interest. And their understanding has proved prescient. In 228 years, Congress has only in 5 conflicts voted to declare war. And in every one of those conflicts, Congress didn't take the nation from peace to war. It declared that we had been placed in a state of war by an aggressor. First by the British, second by the Mexicans, third by the Spanish, fourth by the Germans, fifth by the Japanese. It didn't vote to go to war. It said, we are at war because someone has attacked us. Now we have to respond appropriately. That began to change with the Korean War when President Truman, after he promised Congress he would come to them for a declaration if he wanted to use U.S. troops under United Nations authority, broke the promise and went to war in Korea without a crumb of congressional authorization. And I want to address the issue of, well, what about the appropriations power? Can't Congress stop the wars by stopping the appropriation of funds? Well, number one, the framers didn't think the appropriations process was a substitute for the Declare War Clause. Otherwise, why would they write the Declare War Clause if always the power of the purse is what's to be the remedy for a presidential war? And secondly, the power of the purse comes after the fact. After the president's already deployed troops, it's much harder to protest. Well, you're leaving the troops abandoned out there. You're not funding them. And moreover, nowadays, we don't even fund specific wars. We just throw it into an outer continental contingency fund and you suspend wherever you want to without even identifying any congressional earmark for a particular war, as was done in Libya. Now, what about the War Powers Resolution? Isn't that some effort to try to rectify the usurpation of the War Clause by the President? First, no president has ever accepted the validity of the War Powers Resolution. Secondly, it has no teeth, unlike House Resolution 922. You have to give some fear in the executive that there will be a sanction if you run presidential wars without congressional declarations. And the resolution says the sanction is you get impeached and tried, and if you're convicted, you're removed from office. The War Powers Resolution has no punishment for a violation, continuing soldiers after 60 days without congressional affirmance or otherwise. So it doesn't, and in operation, Congress hasn't attempted to enforce it anyway. The last thing I want to address is, well, is this just an anti-Trump measure? The answer is no. As Walter indicated, this issue has been brooding around. It's probably got a gestation period way longer than an elephant, even during the period of W. Bush and Obama and now Trump. The problem has been chronic, no matter who's in the White House, Republican, Democrat, or otherwise. And the resolution specifically applies only prospectively. We're not trying to create new standards and then apply them retrospectively to sandbag President Trump or anyone else. It only applies prospectively. And you could put in the resolution prospectively 6 months, a year, even 2020. The important point is the principle that's established here. Every president needs to know if you initiate war without a congressional declaration, you may lose your office. This is also important for another reason. For too long, the Congress has left unaddressed, providing specific guidance and warning to a president as to what will be an impeachable high crime and misdemeanor. It can't be like then Congressman Ford said, whatever majority of the House believes it ought to be at any particular time and place. That's the standard of total arbitrariness. That's not acceptable for a president. You need to provide warning. We're telling you what we're going to do. You violate it, we'll take action. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, and thank you all for being here. My name is Matthew Ho. I was in the Marine Corps for 10 years. I was a captain, was in Iraq twice, was in Afghanistan, was with the State Department, resigned in protest in 2009 over the escalation of the war in Afghanistan. I want to thank Mr. Jones, Ms. Gabbard, for bringing about this level of accountability. We talk a lot about the material costs of war, the financial costs of war. We talk about the casualty figures. We often don't talk about how wars don't end. And that's why the founders were so explicit with their declare war cause. There has to be accountability because the wars do not end. They continue to wreck lives for generations. And that's not new. We know in the Civil War, if you visited any town in the United States in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, you found a Civil War veteran on the streets, in the saloons, wrecking themselves because of the war. The estimates are 500,000 Civil War veterans died from opiate overdoses after the war. In World War II, 7 million men saw combat out of 15 million in uniform. 1.5 million of them were discharged at the time, at the period. And remember, PTSD didn't become a diagnosed condition until 1980. 1.5 million out of 7 million men who saw combat were discharged from active duty service in the Army in World War II because of psychiatric or psychological conditions. Those men, they are now killing themselves at a rate 4 times higher than their civilian peers. So if you're a World War II veteran, you're 4 times as likely to kill yourself than if you didn't go to war. And that continues today. Our youngest veterans are killing themselves at a rate 6 times that of their civilian peers. So if you're a young man or a young woman who went to Iraq or Afghanistan, you are 6 times more likely to kill yourself than a young man or young woman who did not. For our infantry units, we've seen rates 14 times higher than those who didn't go to combat. And somehow this myth persists that only 10% of guys and gals who go to war see combat. It's a myth. It's not true. You look at any of the statistics from the Army, from the Veterans Administration, from the RAND Corporation, from academic studies. The men and women of Iraq and Afghanistan have seen more combat than any previous generation of war. Between 50 and 70% of those who have been in Iraq and Afghanistan have experienced direct fire, an IED blast, or seen a friend killed or badly injured. And that's why there must be accountability. And that's why it's so sickening that it's taken this long for some measure of accountability. And I can tell you, as someone who has held mothers in their arms at their son's funerals, young widows in my arms at their son's funeral, someone has to answer for that. And that's what the founders intended. That's what they knew. It's something that's been lost on us, that these wars don't end. And of course, I'm only talking about here in the US. I'm not talking about the 1.5 million who have died in Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Somalia because of our wars and the suffering that goes on there. But again, I want to thank Mr. Jones and Ms. Gabbard for this resolution. It's going to bring some degree of accountability to the killing that has been going on for decades with nobody taking responsibility for it, and immense suffering and heartbreak behind it all. Thank you again for you all being here. I really appreciate it, and thank you again.
Good job, Michael. Very good.
Am I up next, Michael Marshall?
Yes. We have an order.
Yes.
You're
Okay.
next.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Introduce yourself.
Good evening, good afternoon, folks. Good morning, folks. One of these days. My name is Michael Marceau. I'm with the Veterans for Peace DC area chapter. Way back in 1969, in the last century, I got my draft notice on my 20th birthday. My plan was to go to Vietnam for 2 years, do my service to my country, and get on and carry on with my life. Unfortunately, that didn't happen quite the way I planned. When I got to basic training, I was a very naive young white boy from the suburbs. I met young black men from the big cities, young men from the southwest part of the country of Latin background, other young men from the deep rural south. We were all in there with one common purpose, and that was to pull together for our country to do what our country asked of us. One of the things we learned that there are many different jobs in the military. I was in communications, different other jobs like transportation, planning, logistics, artillery, infantry. All those jobs depended on coordination with each other, and we were all working together for the same goal, and that was to make a success of our mission. I see the same thing here in U.S. government. There are different parts of the government that all have to work together to make our mission and our country successful and to live up to the ideals our country was founded on 240 years ago. And when one of those branches of government does not do its job, the whole rest of the mission suffers. Our country is not as good as it could be, as good as we want it to be. So we have to remind people that there are jobs that they need to do. So that's why HRES 922 is such an important piece of legislation. We have to remind our congressional partners here that they need to do their jobs. Sometimes the situation becomes a little unusual when our president does not know the rules of government or does not care to learn the rules of government. That's why it's even more important for the Congress, which is one of three equal branches of government, and I stress equal, has to step up and do its job and remind the president that he works for the American people and not for his own corporation. So thank you to Representative Jones, Representative Gabbard for having this conference today, and I will turn you loose. Thank you.
Thank you, Representatives Gabbard and Jones, for your work to truly support the troops and make sure when we send them to war, it's after the U.S. has exhausted all options and it's done constitutionally. I'm grateful for Congresswoman Gabbard's leadership on national security issues, which comes from being a veteran who voluntarily deployed to Iraq and witnessed horrific foreign policy decisions firsthand. Congressman Jones was one of the first Republicans in Congress to speak out about being misled into the Iraq war debacle. He continues to work fearlessly to bring the troops home from Afghanistan and Iraq and to stop unconstitutional wars like the one in Yemen. With Hawaii and North Carolina possessing some of the largest concentrations of U.S. military personnel and facilities, both your voices on issues of war and peace carry a lot of weight. Let's remember that the American Revolution fought against the tyranny of a king and the unjust concentration of monarch power. The U.S. founders and writers of the Constitution deliberately gave Congress significant powers to declare and fund war. Now, after millions of deaths and over $1 trillion spent in the disastrous, undeclared Vietnam War, Congress decided to try to exercise some of its constitutional rights. In 1973, peace action helped pass the War Powers Act over President Nixon's veto. While that act helped bring constitutional back to Congress, presidents continue to flaunt the Constitution by using military force without a declaration of war. Now, the White House and the Pentagon are engaged in countless military activities around the world, either under the guise of woefully outdated authorizations of use of military force, or with no congressional approval whatsoever. That's why Peace Action and its 200,000 supporters supports House Resolution 922, introduced by Representatives Gabbard and Jones, to let presidents know that circumventing the Constitution and failing to get congressional approval for wars will be considered an impeachable offense. It's long past time to stop permanent presidential war and for the executive branch to ask for congressional authorization and for Congress here in this building to vote on war as the Constitution dictates.
I want to thank each one of the speakers. My comments will be very brief, and then we go to your questions. I have signed well over 11,000 letters to families in this country since I bought the lie from Bush and Cheney to go to the war in Iraq. That's why we are here today, not because of the Iraq War or my signing letters. We're here today because constitutionally we have not met our responsibility. That's been articulated from everybody that spoke before me. In addition to that, let me give you a couple of examples. Mr. Trump sent 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria just a few months ago. Did he come to Congress and tell us and ask us to support it? No. Well, he probably didn't have to, but it was a waste of $1 million per Tomahawk missile. $59 million. Then Mr. Obama went into Libya to take out Gaddafi. He didn't come to Congress. I'm not trying to pick on those two men truthfully, but to give you an example. That's why today, Congresswoman Gabbard, Tulsi is a great friend. That's why we think this is so important. If Congress does not debate sending your son and daughter to die for this country, then we don't need a Congress anyway. Because nothing's more sacred than to send a young woman or man to die for this country. So with that, let me see, why don't everybody come a little bit closer and you call on the person that you would like to answer a question, and I'll step back.